Hey YouTube, it's Justin, aka Demonic Sweaters, here with Vintage Tech Review number 10. Finally back with another Vintage Tech Review. Now, what I'm holding in my hand right here is the Canon EOS Rebel XT, otherwise known as the D350, or 350D rather. This is, well, okay, so vintage tech, you know, I'm pushing the boundary here, but I will say that since this is going to be turning 15 years old next year, I think that will make it officially qualify as vintage, at least in my eyes. So I'm going to go ahead and do this review a little bit early and get a head start on everybody else. So anyway, this is the Rebel XT, as you can see right there, or 350D is what it was known as in Europe. And this thing, you know, when these came out, I really wanted one of these so badly. I just thought they were the coolest thing in the world. They were the first pretty inexpensive DSLR at the time, even though I still didn't have enough money to be able to afford one. I had this like crappy Polaroid point and shoot camera that I used for everything. And I was like starting to get into photography, digital photography at that time. And I saw some people with these and I just really wanted one. In fact, I was working for a company very briefly that was doing real estate photography, and all the photographers were given one of these to take pictures of the houses with. And at that point is when I got to play with one for the first time, and just really wanted one for myself. And years went by, and more and more cameras came out, and this thing kind of got left in the dust with all the DSLRs that are out there right now, and they ended up becoming very cheap. So I ended up buying this one, I think in 2016 or somewhere around there, for under $100 with the lens and everything. You can find them for very cheap on eBay or even used on Amazon. That is not to say this still isn't a great camera. Now, a couple of facts maybe I could mention about it is this was released in early 2005, I believe February of 2005. And that's probably right around the time when I started seeing them pop up. And then it was produced throughout that year, and I think they discontinued production in late 2005, yet they were still being sold new all the way up until 2008. So it appears that Canon made quite a bit of these in the factory and then just kept selling them, even though there were other newer models that came out after it. The one that followed it directly was the XTI, which was also known as the 400D. So like I was saying, it still is a very high quality camera, DSLR. It features the stock lens that it came with was a 18mm to 15mm lens, which is still the standard lens that comes on most new Canon DSLRs. It does not have video. Now this is something, if you're looking into starting a YouTube channel and looking at old DSLRs, that's one thing you should consider, is they really didn't start putting video into DSLRs until around 2008 or somewhere around there. Older models usually are just still image only. So you can't do video with it, but that is expected, like I said, for these older DSLRs. The lens type is standard Canon EF or EFS, EF-S, and that means that you can pretty much use almost any Canon lens on the Rebel XT that you could ever imagine. The only ones that won't work are the EF-M ones, which stands for mirrorless. However, you can put anything on here. There's even new lenses, like, for example, the camera that I'm recording on right now is a Canon SL2, EOS SL2, also a Rebel, and that one has the same type of lens on it that this one has on it right now, and this one is only a year old that you're looking at. So I could swap these lenses on here and they will work just fine. You can also use, believe it or not, old 35mm lenses, film camera lenses, SLR lenses that Canon made that are the EF series. Those will also work on this camera, which is really cool. That gives you a ton of options for the lenses that you can use on this camera. So why would you want something like this in today's world where we have things like smartphones? Like I have a Pixel 3a that takes really incredible photos, and it's a phone. And some of the photos I take on that almost rival, or they do rival, the ones from this camera that I'm recording this video on. But there's certain things you can do on a DSLR that you still can't really do on a phone. And number one being, you can change the lenses. You can't do that on a phone. Being able to change the lens gives you a lot of options. You can get different focal lengths, you can get telephoto lenses, which gives you an optical zoom. An optical zoom as opposed to a digital zoom on a camera. A digital zoom really isn't zooming, it's just cropping the photo and zooming in digitally on one section of that picture. With an optical zoom, it uses the actual lens to zoom in on the object, so you get it actually, the resolution doesn't go down in quality at all when you zoom in. So this lens is not a very powerful zoom, but it gives me a little bit of zoom on there, more than any phone would give me. Another reason you may want to use a DSLR today compared to a phone is it gives you a lot more things to play with. Now, some people may not want this. Some people just want to take a photo and they just want it to be as easy as possible and they don't want to play around with anything, and that's totally fine. Sometimes I feel that way too, but if I'm feeling creative, you can't get more creative on a phone than you can with a DSLR. You just can't, because there's a lot more manual settings. You can do manual focus. You have a lot of different options that you can set up on a DSLR that you really can't do on a phone. All right, so let's go over some of the features that are available on this Rebel XT. As I said before, there's no video, but this is to be expected of old DSLRs. But there are several automatic modes that you can choose from that do an amazing job with pictures that don't require you to know too much about photography. Some of these modes are the fully automatic mode, which basically you set it on and that allows you to take pictures, just point and shoot, easiest way possible. The second mode is the portrait mode. Now, portrait mode is something you see on a lot of phones these days, and you're probably familiar with what that means. It's going to focus on the subject and then blur out the background. It works pretty well on this camera, but to my taste, it tends to want to use the flash a little bit too much, and you can't really adjust other parameters. But there's other ways to get this effect, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. The next mode in automatic shooting is the landscape mode. Now, landscape is going to give you a very wide depth of field, so you can capture buildings, landscapes, scenery and things like that, big open spaces that you can capture. The next automatic mode is the sports or action mode, and that is the little running guy symbol on there. And what this does, it actually gives you a high shutter speed, but then also changes the autofocus mode to a continuous autofocus. So when the subject moves, it follows that subject and continues autofocusing on the subject as you take the photo. So you can, take photos in sporting events and dancing and things like that. And then we have the night portrait mode, and this is similar to portrait but more geared towards doing at night, and this will use the flash, and it's recommended that you use a tripod in this mode, even though I've never really played around with this mode too much, just because I haven't had the opportunity to, or really even the situation where I've needed to use it. And then finally we have flash off mode. Now, flash off mode is basically just like the fully automatic mode, but it turns the flash in a permanently off state, so that way your flash won't go off if you're somewhere where you can't take flash photography, or you just don't like the way it looks with the flash. You can use the flash off mode and it will make it so that flash just never goes off. All right, so the creative modes are where this camera really starts to shine, and it's going to be very similar to a lot of other DSLRs. What we have to work with here is the first one is going to be, it's just a big P, and what that stands for is program. And then if you look at the manual, it actually says program AE, which means auto exposure. So this is very close to the fully automatic mode, but it allows you to basically take over certain parameters and set them the way you like. So you can change the shutter speed and the aperture values, but it does them together. There's no individual control. So when you change the shutter speed and aperture, basically one is going to affect the other in this mode. It also allows you to change the ISO. Now this is really important and something you can't do in the automatic mode. Now the ISO on this camera is pretty good for the time that it was created. Well, actually it was really good for the time that it was created. By today's standards, it's not the greatest, but it's still pretty good. And it can go from 100 to 1600 ISO. So what that means is if you set it on 100, that's going to be great for outside in brightly lit situations. But if you're inside in low lit situations, what you could do is set your ISO all the way up to 1600, and then you really don't need to use the flash indoor, and you can get some pretty nice looking photos just taking with the high ISO and no flash indoor, even in pretty low light. Of course, they are going to be a bit grainy because the sensor on this camera is fairly old compared to new cameras, so the graininess is there, but to me, I think it actually looks pretty cool. It gives it almost more of a film look. In addition to the program mode, you also have something called TV, and what that stands for is time value mode. Now, time value mode, I don't know why they decided to call it that. What it's really talking about is the shutter speed. So what you could do with this is actually a really, really cool feature because what you could do is set up really long exposure times, and you could do things like light drawing and all kinds of cool effects that you really can't do on a smartphone. The shutter speeds that you can do on this camera are actually pretty flexible. You can go from 1/4000th of, I have a hard time saying that, 1/4000th of a second, all the way up to 30 seconds or bulb. Now what bulb means is basically the entire time you're holding down the shutter will remain open. So you can get as long a shutter speed as you can possibly imagine. Now, what you could do with that too is you can use it on a tripod, and they actually make a remote for these cameras, which will still work today. You can order remotes. Actually, Amazon makes one that I just ordered, which I haven't gotten yet, but there's an Amazon basic remote that will work with this camera, and it's only like $8. And so you can set this on a tripod and hold your shutter open as long as you want. Now that's really cool if you want to do like night photography, or if you want to do, like I said, like light drawings, which I've been experimenting with a little bit. I'm not so great at them yet, but that is something that you can do with this camera. Next on the creative modes is AV, and that stands for aperture value. And aperture value basically is your aperture priority. Now aperture is basically how much light gets allowed into the lens. And this is how you achieve those blurry background photos in portraits. Now, a lot of phones and things that do this today, like the iPhone and the Google Pixel 3a, they do a really good job at this, but it's actually fake. It's not really doing it the way that a real DSLR will do it. It's not to say that it's worse, it's just kind of like a simulated version of the technique. For example, if you take on a portrait mode on a phone, it's always going to have two copies. It'll have the one with the background in focus and then the other one with the background blurred out, which you could also do in software like the GIMP or something like that without having to have a special phone. But if you want to achieve it on a camera with manual features, basically what you want to do is have a very narrow depth of field. Now what that means is when you have the number lower on the aperture value, it actually means that the lens is open bigger, and then it will allow more light in but create a narrower depth of field. And I know that's all kind of confusing, and I hope I said it right, but what that can do is that'll blur out that background. If you have a wide depth of field, then everything will be in focus. So that's good for like landscape or something like that. But what the AV creative mode allows you to do is prioritize that, so you can set that very narrow depth of field, and then it'll set all the other parameters automatically so you can get that nice blurry background on a photo. Okay, and then our final, well, second to final creative mode is the manual mode on the camera, and that just has an M. It basically allows you to set all of the parameters that you like. You can do shutter speed, you can do autofocus type, you can do the light metering, you can do white balance, you can do ISO, you can do aperture, you can do shutter speed, I think I already said that, but it's just fully manual. So that's all you need to really know about manual, and that is for advanced shooting. You really need to know what you're doing at that point, but it's all pretty easy to do once you get the hang of it on the Rebel XT. So the final creative mode is the ADEP, or ADEPT, and what that stands for is automatic depth of field, I think. But what this is actually used for is more for like if you have more than one subject in a photo, say you have like 3 or 4 people, and they're all kind of in different, positions away from the camera, and you want them all to be in focus. So that's how, or what you would use that type of setting for. Now this one to me actually seems, it's actually closer to one of the automatic modes than the creative modes, but for some reason they decided to put it in the creative mode of the camera. But still, really cool stuff. And a couple other things that I wanted to mention. The lens cap, this is a replacement lens cap that I got with the little leash right there, which is great, so that way I don't lose it. And plus this stays on better than the original one ever did. The original Canon lens caps come off really easily. A couple other things to note is on the back, you'll notice the LCD screen is actually quite small. Let me turn it on here so you can see. I believe it's probably like 3 inches. I don't have the specs in front of me. But as you can see, it's pretty small, but it's still pretty clear. But you don't really have to worry about that because you're not really ever going to be using that to shoot, or in fact, you're never going to be using it to shoot because you can't. That's not how this camera works. In order to shoot a photo and to see what you're shooting, you have to look through the viewfinder because they did not design it to use the screen to take photos. The screen is just for looking at photos you took and going through the settings, and that's really all. All the parameters of shooting are all displayed on this little LCD up here, which also you can see when you look through the viewfinder of the actual camera. Those are listed along the bottom too. And then you also have your autofocus points that you can see superimposed over your viewfinder as well. And that is how you do the autofocus. But I'm not going to get fully into that. That's something that's detailed out in the manual, that if you have one of these, you should definitely read the manual to get the most out of it. All right, so now's the fun part. I'm going to go ahead and take some sample photos, and what I'm going to do too is do a couple comparisons. I'm going to take some photos with the Rebel XT and take some with my Google Pixel 3a, as well as just do some experimental photos in creative mode and see what I can come up with. That'll do it for this episode of Vintage Tech Reviews, and that is the Canon EOS Rebel XT from 2005 digital SLR camera. Now, if you like the music in that last section, that's off my album Minnesota, which you can pick up on 180 gram vinyl with the link down below. Anyway, thanks for watching, everybody, and hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, let me know by leaving a comment or subscribing or clicking the like button. Anyway, see you guys really soon.